So that patient had identified with a self that was a sort of co-determined by original self and the device. And therefore, once the device was explanted, she perceived that a part of herself was removed.
Wow.
So this is what I consider to be the first case, real world case of something that with my colleague Surya Sukheder, Jennifer Chandler, and Christoph Bublitz, we have called the hybrid mind.
We're going through something absolutely historic.
Technologies across the board are growing exponentially.
It's a disruption that's going to completely redefine the way businesses compete.
In the next decade, we're going to lose 40% of today's Fortune 500 companies.
The exponential growth of computing is continuing.
AI is nowhere near its full potential.
Whether you like it or not, that the future cannot be stopped by anyone.
So welcome back to another episode of the Futuretech and Foresight podcast. As always, I'm your host, Mark Verbenkov. So with the exponential growth of technologies that continue to give us a plethora of new tools as well as disruptions, for any of you out there trying to keep track with the explosion of specifically AI tools and uses, I'm sure that you can agree it's kind of getting to be beyond our capabilities of any one single human to keep up with this. And this is one of the reasons that brain-computer interface technologies have been so interesting lately, as they offer the somewhat distant vision of being able to churn through more information at faster and faster rates than what we are capable of doing today at a biological and kind of organic level. And this will enable us to keep up with the latest developments, tools, and opportunities that the future will bring us. As it is one of the more fascinating emerging technologies of our day, the topic of brain-machine interfaces has either been fully covered or come up at least a number of times in conversation on the podcast before. But today we'll be looking at another aspect of it. So I actually read recently a really interesting article that looked at the issues that a patient experienced when her implant was removed against her desire after using it for some time. So she, as you can probably imagine, had a large number of negative psychological repercussions and even felt like part of her self was missing because of its explantation. So because of this, I think more questions around ethics and human rights kind of bubble to the surface with this emerging technology, especially as we move forward into a time where BCIs are likely to be used by ever greater parts of the population. Luckily, today my guest Marcello Ienca was one of the authors of the article and has been at the kind of tip of the spear of the emerging field of neurorights, which we'll get deeper into during our discussion today. So who is my guest? Dr. Marcello Ienca is a professor of ethics of artificial intelligence and neuroscience at the Technical University of Munich and a principal investigator at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Lausanne. He was an appointed member of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, steering committee on neurotechnology that drafted the OECD recommendation on responsible innovation in neurotechnology. Dr. Ienca is the neuroethics lead on the International Brain Initiative and an expert advisor to the UN and the Council of Europe. Marcello's research focuses on the ethical, legal, social, and policy implications of emerging technologies. In particular, he conducts research on the ethical, sustainable development of AI systems and neurotechnologies. He uses theoretical and empirical methods to investigate the ethical, social, and political implications of these technologies, focusing on topics such as the brain-machine interface, the relationship between AI and human cognition, and the ethical processing of big data. Great. Well, hi there, Marcello. Thank you very much for coming onto the podcast today to talk about BCI, neurotech, and some of the rights and issues that'll be coming on into the future. So thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
So I think the way that I like to start most of the podcast is to get a little bit of kind of a personal perspective from you as to what made you kind of initially interested to go into the field and touch on the technology that you're focused on right now. So what got you interested in neurotechnology and neurorights to start off with?
Well, let's put it that way. So as a student, I was very much interested in what we're used to call cognitive science, really as a sort of interdisciplinary endeavor aimed at studying systems that can process information, either biological or artificial systems. And so I developed a mixed background in the philosophy of neuroscience. I was also very interested in theoretical artificial intelligence. And then all this interest sort of converged in my PhD. I was studying the impacts of AI in neuroscience, especially AI embedded in neurotechnology. And almost automatically, the study of the theoretical and methodological implications of that was combined with the study of the ethical implications of it, for the obvious reason that if we intervene into the brain, we are intervening into the core component of what we are and what constitutes us as persons. And so since then, I think my research interested in empirical science and normative ethics have been going hand in hand.
Yeah, I think this is something that keeps coming up in the conversations that I have with even people that might not be very familiar with BCI and neurotech in general, right? There's always this maybe not even background, but just kind of in the foreground. Well, what about the ethical implications of, implanting somebody? So I guess there's kind of a initial real interest in that for most people. So one of the main reasons that we connected, or that I reached out to you, was that there was this MIT article based on a paper, a study that you were connected to. And one of the interesting things that we talked about beforehand was kind of this patient R's experience. So maybe you could, for the people, of course, I'll have it in the show notes, but for the people that haven't read the article yet, could you kind of briefly explain what happened in this study? And then we can dive into kind of patient R's experience, which I think is fascinating and will be really interesting for people to hear about.
Sure. So the paper you're referring to is a paper that appeared earlier this year in brain stimulation, and it's co-authored with Mark Cook and Frederick Gilbert from Australia, and they have actually been following the case of this patient R, who is a patient who enrolled in a first-in-human trial for an implantable neurotechnology. So it's an implantable brain-computer interface that operates as an advisory system for epilepsy. And that device was manufactured by a company that subsequently went bankrupt. And the company's bankrupt led to the necessity of explanting the device from the patient's brain, which was rather unfortunate because she had reported betterment of her condition due to the implantable BCI. So it's it was a case in which the neurotechnology was improving the well-being and sense of safety of the patient. But she had to undergo what we can call a forceful explantation, even though, it was not a gunpoint. It's simply that the device had no possibility of maintenance, and therefore, for safety reason, it had to be removed. And so my colleague, Frederick, who led the study, interviewed this patient before and after the explantation. And what these interviews revealed, so he used qualitative interview methods, and these interviews revealed what we consider to be the first reported case of what we call agential discontinuity. So there is a discontinuity in the sense of agency of this person. Why? Because that patient had partly identified so that patient had identified with a self that was a sort of co-determined by original self and the device. And therefore, once the device was explanted, she perceived that a part of herself was removed.
Wow.
So this is what I consider to be the first case, real world case of something that with my colleague Surya Sukheder, Jennifer Chandler, and Christoph Bublitz, we have called the hybrid mind. So a state in which a human has some kind of hybridization between biological cognition and artificial cognition. So you have a kind of bidirectional exchange between an AI system and a biological cognitive system in a way that enables this kind of bidirectional exchange between the two components, so that the resulting behavioral outputs are not entirely attributable to either of the two, but are only attributable to the combination of human and artificial intelligence.
Very cool. Maybe also for the benefit of the audience, maybe can you give a little bit of a description as to what kind of the benefits this person was experiencing? I think a lot of people hear about, BCI and neurotech, but maybe sometimes it's a little bit, it's a little bit distanced about like what the actual benefits can actually be experienced for some of these people.
So to put it very simply, a brain-computer interface is any neuroinformatics system, so any technology that can establish a direct connection pathway between a biological brain and an external computer device in a way that bypasses the peripheral neuromuscular system, so that this device can be a robotic arm, an electronic wheelchair, or simply a cursor on your laptop, is directly controlled through brain activity.
Yep.
And this can be done for a variety of purposes. It can be done to let people with physical disabilities, for example, people who are tetraplegic, to control robotic devices with their brain activity, maybe because they do not have any other viable channel of communication with those devices. Or it can be a neurostimulation device, meaning that the BCI cannot simply read out information from the brain, but can also write into the brain, sort of override the brain through electrical activity. And this, you also have bimodal BCIs that have both, so that read out from the brain and they write into the brain through neuromodulation or neurostimulation. Now, the device that this patient was using was an advisory system for epilepsy. So if you have epilepsy, there are these advisory systems that basically are designed to detect anomalies in your brain activity that can be prodromal of an epileptic seizure, so that the BCI can recognize, oh, something is going to happen. And then some of these devices are also responsive, meaning when they realize that something is going to happen, for example, an epileptic seizure is going to happen, then they also directly neuromodulate in order to prevent that from happening or to mitigate the effects of that seizure. And this patient was enrolled in one of the studies. That was an implantable advisory system for epilepsy. And the benefit that she reported was, first of all, a better control of her condition, but also a much greater sense of safety. So if you know that you have a functioning advisory system that tells you when an epileptic seizure is going to happen, then you can feel way safer when the advisory system is reporting no anomaly. And for example, you feel more confident with driving or doing activities that can become very risky if you experience an epileptic seizure while you're completing these actions.
Yeah, so I can imagine the kind of sense of independence or self-sufficiency would have been drastically improved from before.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. And maybe just to get a little bit more granular, again, to kind of paint a better picture for the audience here, what kind of advisory system was it? Was she get like a notification on an app? Was there a light going off somewhere? What kind of physical thing was she seeing so that she would be advised that, say, an epileptic seizure was going to happen in like a minute or so?
To be very honest with you, I'm not sure about the kind of notification system that was in use with this particular device. But normally, normally you have mostly this kind of notifications that can inform you automatically when that occurs. Usually you have a buzz. And then if the device is smartphone compatible, for example, you can have more detailed information. But typically you have this immediate reaction, which can be acoustic or visual, but that gives you an immediate feedback so that you can modulate your behavior accordingly.
Yeah, crazy. Okay, so patient R had this phenomenal benefit brought into her life. The company goes bankrupt. It has to be taken out. What kind of issues was she experiencing afterwards, specifically psychological? You mentioned it a little bit before, but maybe we can dive into it a little bit deeper.
Yeah, it's funny that you use the adjective phenomenal, because we were really interested in exploring the phenomenology of this patient. So the impact of the device on their subjective experience. So basically she reported, as I mentioned before, a sort of intertwined phenomenology with the device, so that the device was part of her sense of self, was part of her personal identity, and was part of her sense of agency. And therefore, when the device was explanted, she felt that something was missing, but not something that belongs to her property, something that belongs to herself. That something constitutive of her agency, something constitutive of her personal identity, was missing. And therefore, we call this agential discontinuity, because her sense of agency was experiencing discontinuity. In some other work with my colleague Roberta Andorno, we call this interruption of psychological continuity. So there are many theories of personal identity in neuroscience and philosophy, but one of those theories goes under the name of psychological continuity, because it basically, the underlying idea is that we are what we are to the extent to which there is some kind of continuity in the chain of our mental states, so that we consider ourselves the same person as we were in the past, because there is the strong continuity in our sense of self, which is resulting from a continuity in the chain of our mental states. But if that chain is broken, then this may have quite detrimental impacts on how we experience ourselves and how we perceive ourselves. And this is likely what happened with these patients. And of course, we use qualitative methods so that this allowed my colleague and friend Frederick to explore also the motivations and the explanations of why this was being perceived as a agential discontinuity. And indeed, it seems that people tend to perceive removal of a device as agential discontinuity if the device was previously perceived as essential or as constitutive of what they are. And it should be highlighted here that a lot of patients tend to report that the device became part of their self under the condition that their original sense of self was already disrupted by the disease. This is something that we're also observing a lot with another cohort of patients that I'm directly those views I'm directly exploring in my research. That's a cohort of Swiss patients who use deep brain stimulation.
Okay.
They're mostly patients with Parkinson's disease, and they use a similar implantable BCI, but the deep brain stimulation is implanted deep in the brain, so in the brain stem. And the goal of this technology is to mitigate or even remove the symptoms related to tremor, which is a very impairing condition in Parkinson's disease. When it's very advanced, this tremor reaches a point where you're no longer capable of grabbing a glass to drink some water, or feeding yourself autonomously, or toileting, bathing. All the activities of daily living becomes a major challenge, if not possible at all. And then these patients had a brain implant to mitigate these symptoms. Also, in this case, the device seems to contribute massively to the well-being of the patient. This is a much more established, let's say, almost routine application for people with Parkinson's disease that have already explored pharmacological therapy with limited success. But then these patients are reporting to us that their sense of self was completely disrupted by Parkinson's disease. So we're no longer perceiving themselves as the same person that we're used to be, because the disease has completely changed them.
Right.
And so the BCI implanted in their brain was perceived as something that was capable to some extent, sometimes to a large extent, to restore that original sense of self that was disrupted by the disease. And so for this reason, it's reasonable to hypothesize that once you have a device that is working well and is restoring your sense of self in some way, then when that device gets explanted, then you're losing that continuity of yourself, and you're kind of returning to that old self that was disrupted by the disease. And this Parkinson's patients are also reporting to us that they consider the device to be constitutive of their person, precisely for this reason, and not just mere property, which has a lot of interesting ethical implications, right? Because if a device is no longer property, but is part of yourself, then its moral and legal status is way more similar to that of an organ rather than another technological device. So if you disrupt the functioning of my iPhone, either you hack it to extract information, or maybe you just destroy it with a hammer, that's property damage. You cannot be persecuted for personal assault. But if you do the same thing to a brain-computer interface that is implanted in my brain, or maybe it's not even implanted, it's a non-invasive one, but it's functionally equivalent to one that it's implanted in my brain, then it's not so clear from an ethical and legal perspective if that should be considered a property damage or a personal assault. And a lot of patients we are interviewing report to us that they think that should be considered a personal assault, because they consider the device to be so essential and constitutive of their person that cannot be compared to any other piece of technology that they own.
That's absolutely fascinating. It also seems logical. Like when you're speaking, especially when you brought up your phone as an example, I've heard of examples of, say, maybe younger teenagers who become highly addicted or linked to their phones, and say like parents take their phones away and they go into some sort of tantrum or rage, or there's this maybe it's not to the level of disassociation that the patients that you're working with are, but there's still some sense of separation of a form of a self when that cell phone is taken away. Has there been any I guess studies that looked at cell phone and the addiction or the deeper link of cell phone use that has given way or given some sort of ideas to the kind of ideas that you're talking about?
I'm glad you used the word addiction here, because I think this is a very important distinction to draw between the two cases. So I think in the case of the patients using implantable BCIs, there is no scientifically or clinically meaningful way in which we can say that they are addicted to the device. The device is perceived as constitutive of the person, but not because it's triggering addictive pathways or addictive patterns in their brains. It's simply becoming functionally equivalent to certain brain functions that before the onset of their disease were used to be entirely implemented by their biological brain. And now, since these functions are no longer implemented by the biological brain because their brain has been disrupted by the disease, then the device can restore to some extent that original self that they have seen fading or going missed during their patient trajectory. In the case of teenagers who have some kind of kind of abstinence, similar abstinence-like symptoms related to cell phone use, there is some preliminary evidence that shows that actually these devices, and can be smartphones, but there is similar research going on social media platforms, are enabled by smartphones as hardware, but that can trigger the very same dopaminergic pathways that occur in substance addiction. So in that case, I think there is an important distinction to draw, because the device is not becoming constitutive of their person, but the device is triggering some forms of addiction that can modulate significantly their behavior. I would probably, this is something I haven't been reflecting a lot, but I would probably posit the opposite, that the device, rather of becoming constitutive of their person in that case, it's kind of pushing them away from their real self, because they are becoming something else. They are becoming something, someone who is addicted to something. And typically when you are addicted to something, you are no longer your real self. If you're addicted to heroin, you're hardly your real self, your true self. You are someone who is being hijacked by a certain molecule. In this case, there is no molecule that is hijacking you. There are chips that are implemented in hardware.
Yeah, really interesting difference there. So I definitely want to go back to the ethical implications, right? Because that's, I think, one of the big chunks that we need to discuss. But I also want to make it a little bit more tangible for the audience here, specifically with regards to kind of patient R and maybe some of the other patients that you were talking about with Parkinson's. When the device was explanted, I can only assume that, say, patient R went through some rather deep forms of depression. Were there any other kind of negative psychological or real life problems that came up in the interviews? I don't want to get too dark, but I think it's important for the audience to know that there's not just this differentiation between the past self and now the current self, but maybe some like more tangible psychological impacts.
Yeah, well, first of all, to be scientifically honest, I have to say at the beginning that whatever I'm going to say now can be hard generalized, simply because we don't have sufficient evidence. So there are very few patients around the world who are using neural implants, especially let's call them AI powered. So we call them closed loop neural implants. Of those who are using these devices, we are not aware of many cases of explantation. Personally, I know only this patient. And then within that, there is limited availability of information over time. So we also don't have longitudinal studies. So we have a risk of interpersonal variability and intrapersonal variability over time. So everything I'm going to say is based on a very limited sample.
Right.
Of course, if you have a device that is implanted in your brain and works very well, and then it has to be removed for whatever reason that is not under your control and has nothing to do with you, it has to do with the destiny of a company on the stock market, then if that has to be removed against your will, then you're going to experience negative emotions. And those negative emotions can be very deep and persisting, because it can lead to some kind of disorientation in your sense of self, in your consciousness, in your conscious experience. So it can be very pernicious. And if you are no longer recognizing yourself as yourself, and this is happening because of something that is beyond your control, that can be emotionally very negative. That being said, other symptoms that should be taken into consideration is that explantation, just like implantation, requires neurosurgery. So you also have to undergo another medical procedure that has certain risks. So, implanting and explanting things in the brain still have some degree of risk. For example, risk of brain infection or bleeding. In 2023, this risk is below 5%, but still, it's non-negligible, I think. And if you have to do that because you have therapeutic benefit inside, which is what happens with implantation, then you're willing to take that risk. But if you have to do that because there is no alternative, but still there is no therapeutic benefit associated with the procedure, then I believe that's also something that should be taken into account as a negative side effect.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, why don't we jump back into the ethical situations, the ethical considerations of implantation and explantation. So you are working on kind of building up this concept of neurorights. Could you, because this is, I think, the first time that this has come up on the podcast, could you maybe elaborate a little bit on that? I mean, there was some discussion of it before, but for people that might not have heard of this concept before, can you just explain that, and then we can dive kind of into the deeper situations when it comes to neurorights?
Sure. So the idea of neurorights dates back to 2015, 2016, when I was already working on the ethical implications of neurotechnology. And I was also very much aware of legal implications of neurotechnology use. What we mentioned before regarding property damage or personal assault is a typical implication in criminal law, for criminal law. But I was also observing that the debate around neurotechnology was mostly focusing on either normative ethics or when it was linked to the law, it was mostly looking at forensic psychiatry or, as I said, criminal law. So, or can we use neurotechnology as evidence in court? This sets of questions. But there was no real reflection on the human rights implications of neurotechnology, which I found very surprising, considering the fact that, as I mentioned at the beginning, intervening into the brain means intervening into the core component of what we are. So if this does not raise human rights issues, then I don't know what a human rights issue is at all, right? Because, we are really intervening into what it means to be a human. And I was debating this with a human rights lawyer from the University of Zurich, an Argentinian lawyer, Roberto Andorno, and then we jointly agreed on the fact that this was a gap that needed to be filled in the ethical legal reflection on neurotechnology. And so we wrote an article where we basically did two things. So one was comparative legal analysis of human rights documents, so legal instruments in the international human rights frameworks, such as conventions and charters and so on, to understand the extent to which these instruments are well equipped to address the challenges raised by neurotechnologies. And the second thing was to sort of create a taxonomy of existing neurotechnologies in order to map and assess this challenges for human rights. And then our joint analysis concluded that the existing legal instruments might not be well equipped to address these challenges. And so we have argued in favor of developing new rights or specifying existing rights. And I will explain later what I mean by that, that are specific for the protection of the brain and mind of humans. I said brand new rights or evolutionary interpretations of existing rights, because we decided to remain agnostic about whether the best way to intervene to solve this problem is to create new rights or is to further elaborate on the rights we have in order to spell out the specifics, the specific implications raised by neurotechnologies. But what we think it was important is to create this category of human rights that is focusing on what's inside your skull, on the brain and mind of people. And when I say brain mind, I don't mean to refer to some kind of dualism that the mind is something else from the brain. It's just it's two, to me, they're the same substance, but it's useful to operationalize them as two different ways, because there are important implications that are directly related to neurobiology, but there are also implications that are relevant from a functional perspective. So from the faculties that are enabled by the underlying neurobiology. And so the idea of neurorights emerged this way. And around the same time, Raphael Juste was also reflecting on similar issues in New York City. And then later, or the end of that year or earlier next year, he also published an article on the same topic. And so this kind of ignited or sparked a new reflection or a new way to look at ethical issues in neurotechnology. So not only in the form of violations to certain precepts or reflection on certain behaviors and attitudes of relevant stakeholders, but really also looking at these issues from the perspective of rights and obligations. What rights are humans entitled to exercise in relation to their brain and mind? And this is, I think, a new way to look at the problem that since then raised a lot of attention in the scientific community, but also among policymakers. So since then, a lot of intergovernmental organizations, such as the Council of Europe, here in the European space, but also the OECD, which is a sort of cross-continental intergovernmental organization, as well as more recently the UN, the United Nations, have been creating working groups or launched strategic action plans to understand neurorights. And actually, as we speak, next week, there will be an international conference organized by UNESCO in Paris, where most people working on neurorights will convene. And we are already at a point where this abstract reflections are being translated into actionable policies by governmental and intergovernmental agencies.
Okay, that's very interesting. Yeah, that was going to be my follow-up question. Like, what has the feedback been? Have you been given any kind of pushback against some of these things that you're proposing? But it sounds like there's general understanding of the importance of this and acceptance of, turning this into some sort of policy or laws that's going forward. I think especially as people are starting to understand or wake up to the fact that, BCI technology and this kind of merging between man and machine is gonna become maybe not ubiquitous, but it's going to become ever more present as time goes on.
Yeah. So pushback. I think one common objection that we have received is, well, if you call anything that is morally desirable a human right, then this dilutes the very notion of human rights. And we should also be mindful that maybe the existing documents, the existing instruments, or the rights therein contained are sufficiently equipped to address these challenges. But nobody denies that the challenges raised by neurotechnology are fundamental. Now, to the first objection, we responded by doing what actually human rights lawyers do, so to do an assessment, to avoid what is often called rights proliferation. So before something is considered to be a fundamental right, you have to make an assessment. It has to fulfill certain criteria that show the necessity of doing so. And the second point, as I mentioned earlier, I'm not a human rights lawyer, so I am agnostic with regard to what's the best way to intervene. My point was a point, let's say, about a diagnosis, not about therapy. I will let it open to human rights experts to understand what's the best therapy, and ultimately to the world democratic citizenship, because ultimately in a democratic country, people should freely and openly participate in the debate concerning the protection of their rights. So I'm not in favor of a vertical, top-down, technocratic approach where experts tell the world what rights people should be entitled to exercise. So I always wanted to remain agnostic about this, because I think, rights are important, are actually fundamental, and they belong to everyone, and this debate should not be monopolized by experts. But on the other hand, I think there was some general agreeance that the challenges raised by neurotechnology are greater in magnitude than other technological developments that we have seen, that we have witnessed recently, and also that neurorights are a thing in the sense that neurotechnologies have direct implications for fundamental human rights, and therefore having this category of neurorights is useful to address that. And now we can discuss about whether the best way to enforce neurorights is to create novel rights to be enshrined in international instruments, or it is to spell out and interpret in an evolutionary way the rights that we already have, such as the right to freedom of thought. And I am in principle open to that.
So you're mentioning this kind of concern or possibility of a top-down enforcement of some of these things, of some of these rights. Do you, maybe looking forward a little bit, do you see that organizations like the UN or the OECD getting involved in this as a general good thing? Are they? I mean, they're obviously going to be able to put these policies in place across a large spectrum of countries and places, but is there any hesitancy or concern on your part when you see these larger organizations getting involved? I mean, you mentioned the conference happening in Paris next week. You know, you and your colleagues are going to be there pushing, you know, maybe the most objective aspect of things, but just from your own perspective, is there any kind of concern about these larger organizations getting involved?
Well, I wouldn't call it concern. I think it's critical. It's very important, and it's something I applaud that this intergovernmental organizations are participating in this debate, and they are sort of facilitating the translation of abstract ideas into potential policy proposals. And ultimately, human rights have been protected by these organizations historically. So the Council of Europe has been overseeing the protection and the promotion of human rights in Europe since World War II, which is very important considering that human rights were dramatically violated before then. And the United Nations are a fundamental organ for planetary policy, we could call it. There is no other organization that has this kind of reach across all continents. And it has also been fundamental in the protection and promotion of human rights. So I think their participation is definitely a massive good news.
Okay,
but one concern I have is that, you know, I'll give you an analogy. So if we talk about things like rights of minorities or labor rights, or, you know, the rights of sexual minorities, right, such as the right to universal marriage. These are all things that people are willing to go on the streets and fight for.
Yeah,
they are willing to do sit-ins and protests, and this is not happening for neurorights yet. And the reason for that stems from the fact, in my view, that neurotechnologies are not so widely distributed, and we do not have massive cases of neurorights violations yet. So it is important to keep in mind that there is no sufficient critical mass at the moment, and that the lack of this critical mass is mostly due to a limited awareness in the general population about these issues. So I think one key activity that we all have a moral responsibility to do is to increase the awareness of the general population about neurorights and ethical implications of neurotechnology more broadly, because only then can neurorights be introduced in a way that is democratically accountable. And we need to combine this top-down process with a bottom-up process. So I will keep serving as an advisor to the organizations I mentioned before, because this is, I think, very important, and it's part of my moral responsibility of a scientist. But on the other hand, I would like to see in the next few years a similar process that is grassroots, bottom up, and it really enables platforms of empowerment and participation of the general public in this debate, because ultimately human rights are such because they belong to all human rights without distinctions. And I also think that it's very important to address these challenges before massive violations occur. We have to be proactive and not simply reactive in this case, simply because the stakes are too high.
Yeah. Couldn't agree further. Well, hopefully this podcast and this discussion will be part of that, at the very least, an awareness raising of these issues. So thanks for coming on to raise those awareness, to raise those issues. One of the things that I was thinking of when you were talking was, there's already some violations of these rights that I've been told from other guests. So, for instance, there was a case of, I believe it was in China. There were some, whether they're construction workers or maybe even metro drivers or bus drivers, that had to wear a specific type of hat or helmet that had the ability to read the employees. I don't think clearly not their entire mind, but able to note when they were scrolling on Facebook or TikTok or whatever, or whether they were paying attention to the work that they were doing. So there's and this was enforced on them. They didn't have necessarily a right to decide whether this was going to happen. The organization, or whether it was a local municipality, enforced this on the staff members. So I think that there's already some sort of infringement upon these neurorights that are happening right now. You mentioned, with regards to different kind of minorities or different groups of people that have already been pushing for their right to do, the certain things that they want. Do you see, as these BCI technologies becoming more popular, becoming more well-known, that say in, roughly 10 years time, we might have some marches or some protests for neuro rights, or for the ability to decide to have these kinds of technologies in the workplace, for instance? Is this one of the things that you're maybe, perceiving will happen in the next 5, 10, 15 years or so?
Yes. So I want to make clear that neurorights are not just negative rights. They're also positive rights. We were very explicit about that with Roberto in our paper. So neurorights are definitely about preventing violations like those you described, but they're also about promoting certain rights that might not be sufficiently recognized. So, for example, a neuroright could also involve the right of an individual to use a neurotechnology and not have that technology being taken away because the company goes bankrupt, or because they cannot afford a certain neural implant. So it's about really giving people the right to control their brain and mind in a way that should be both a freedom from something, but also a positive freedom to do something. And I would rather expect to see quite soonish people protesting in the streets to have a neuro device and have the right to use a certain neuro device that can be beneficial to their health and overall well-being, but they cannot afford that, or that device is not available in the country where they are, or the functionalities are limited based on the terms of use of a company and so on. So this is one area. And then the other area is that of potential violations. And you're absolutely right that this violations have already been occurring. So you reported that case. It's actually, there are multiple reports of high responsibility professionals in China, in a state-backed company, such as conductors at high-speed trains, or people in the production line, or people working at nuclear plants and so on, who have been required to wear devices that can monitor their brain activity, mostly to monitor concentration levels and adapt the flow of production accordingly, or to intervene in case the device can recognize lower levels of concentrations that can be detrimental to safety. Now, I understand the point, but I also see a risk there, because these people do not have the choice about whether they want to use that device and they want to have their brain activity monitored or not. So I think the principle of mental privacy, which is one of the 4 neurorights we produced, might be violated. And actually, mental privacy could also be violated by non-neural technologies, because you don't necessarily need to have access to the neurobiological correlates of your mental states in order to have interferences with your mind. And there are plenty of technologies that are already in use, and they are designed like on purpose with the idea of accessing to a large extent your mental states. And most of the digital infrastructure we have created in our society is arms race to the human mind. Micro-targeted advertising is really designed to bypass your cognitive defenses and influence your behavior by accessing information that you're not even aware of. And so is neuromarketing. And so do social media that operate with business models that rely to a large extent on micro-targeted advertising. And then you have things like personalized search algorithms and all this, and companies that use psychographic profiling to profile people according to their behavior or certain characteristics. And I think these are all regular day-to-day routine violations of neurorights. But the more neurotechnologies will become available, the more we will have people wearing neuro devices for non-clinical purposes, for consumer-related purposes, then the higher the chances that people will also have their rights violated, simply because these technologies will provide with additional information that companies currently do not have. So we are just enriching the picture of what is available, and this will create new opportunities to access information from people's minds and to influence people's behavior based on that information. So I think neurotechnology will probably amplify and exacerbate something that is already happening, and will create new opportunities for augmenting human well-being for those who are in need or for those who want, but also it will create new opportunities for those who want to misuse technology for non-benevolent purposes, such as personal gain or simply commodifying neural data for financial purposes.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting to think about when you lay it out like that. Maybe it's also a good segue into kind of one of the last questions that I typically ask guests on the podcast, right? So the name of the podcast, Futuretech and Foresight, a big aspect of this is trying to draw out insights of what these, fascinating guests that come onto my podcast talk about with regards to the future, right? And over the next 5-10 years. So I can immediately picture, a growing industry of different kinds of lawyers, new kind of jobs, maybe even new of course new technologies that will enable a lot of these things. What's your vision over the next, say, 10 years with a growing amount of BCI technologies, maybe neurorights becoming a more consolidated idea that's put in place across hopefully most countries across the world? What's your future vision with regards to neurotech and these neurorights that we've been discussing about today?
Making clear that I don't have a crystal ball, but I can base my judgment on historical data. I think it's quite remarkable the pace of progress of brain-computer interface technology. So if I look retrospectively at the last 20 years, then or even just 10 years, you said 10 years time window, then it's very remarkable of what the BCI community was able to achieve and the kind of progress that generated. So I would be I'm very hopeful that if we record this interview in 2033, we will have way more brain-computer interfaces that are available for clinical purposes for people in need, for the hundreds of millions of people worldwide who suffer from neurological and neuropsychiatric disorders. And we can make their lives way better. And I think this is really something that I should emphasize, because it's my big hope. And I really hope also that these technologies can be helpful to improve the lives of those people suffering from diseases for which we do not have a pharmacological cure at the moment, so that some kind of, neurotechnologies could do what neuropharmaceuticals could not. This will require more than 10 years, because how long it takes to conduct trials, trials, and translate experimental technology into clinical applications. But I think in 10 years, we will have safer, more effective, more agile, more beneficial neurotechnologies for millions of people suffering from neurological and psychiatric disorders. With regard to the evolution of the ethics debate and the future of neurorights, I think we will have a better, more detailed, granular understanding of the ethical issues, and we will also have some refined tools to address that. So we already have some international standards. For example, I've been working with the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, and the OECD has released at the end of 2019, so it's already 3 years and a half ago, the first international standard on responsible innovation in neurotechnology. And I really hope that in 10 years' time, everyone who is operating in the neurotech sector, especially manufacturers, but also investors, also people operating in clinical translation and so on, will adhere to these guidelines that we have developed, or maybe to new guidelines that will be developed in the next future. So, and then the third step is translating ethical guidelines into binding regulation. And there, it's harder for me to assess since I'm not a politician, but I think it will be important to make sure, as I mentioned before, that we combine this top-down, expert-led approaches that organizations are pursuing right now with the bottom-up work with the general citizenship, because ultimately human rights are a fundamental issue for all human beings, and therefore they should be as inclusive as possible. We should create platforms to do that. And I wouldn't be surprised if in 10 years we already have some neurorights enshrined in not only in intergovernmental instruments, but also in national legislation. And we already have a case of Chile, where they have introduced neurorights into their national regulations. And many other countries, such as Spain, or France, or Argentina, are currently exploring these options.
Okay.
But when I do this, I always want to make clear, because I find myself sometimes in a hard position between the neuroscientists who think, well, talking about ethical, even human rights issues with with regard to neurotechnology is not something good to do, because that will spark fear and panic in the population and may steer funding away. But on the other hand, sometimes I also have the regulators and ethicists and lawyers who think, well, but why are you saying that we should accelerate and increase the development of neurotechnology. And my point is precisely this: we should do both.
Yeah.
So we should make sure that we do not slow down development of neurotechnology, because we need good neurotechnology for millions of people in need. We cannot cure what we cannot measure. We cannot measure what we don't understand. So we need to develop technologies that can help us better understand the brain and develop tailored solutions for people in need. And potentially also for people in not necessarily clinical need, can also be people who have a hard time adjusting to certain cognitive tasks. And we need to make these technologies available. But on the other hand, we have to make sure that these technologies are safe, effective, and do not violate fundamental human rights. Actually, they can promote those rights. And I think this is what the entire Neurorights is about.
Well, I think that's a perfect and clear message to maybe end the podcast on. I'll have to mark a point in my calendar to bring you back on in 10 years' time to see exactly how things have transpired and see if your predictions, or not necessarily predictions, but if they've turned out as you've stated. Thanks again for coming on, Marcello. It's a real pleasure to have picked your brain a little bit on this really interesting topic. I'll have, of course, all the links to the articles that we mentioned, so people can dive into Patient R a little bit more, and the places that you're working at. But if people want to follow you or reach out, maybe what's the best place or link that they can go to?
Well, of course, my university website is the best way to stay up to date with our research. I also use Twitter fairly regularly.
Okay, right on.
But precisely because I want to avoid digital intrusions into my mind, I am a quite parsimonious user of social media. But probably Twitter is the one where most updates from our group appear.
Okay, well done.
Well, thanks again for having me. See you in a decade then.
Absolutely. Thanks again. Well, thanks for listening to this week's Futuretech and Foresight podcast. If you like what you've heard here, there are, of course, a number of ways that you can support the podcast. The best way would be to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or give a rating on Spotify, which you can find a step-by-step explanation for on the futuretechandforesight.com website. Alternatively, feel free to leave a comment either on the episode show notes or the YouTube channel where you can see video recordings of the interviews. And finally, if you are part of an organization that is aware of the disruptive and transformational impact that emerging and future technologies will bring and want to know more, please get in touch to hear about the strategic foresight services that we offer and how we can help future-proof your organization and take advantage of the phenomenal opportunities available to survive and thrive in the future.
A lot of future-shocked people and future-shocked institutions in our society are simply overwhelmed.
Once there is superintelligence, the fate of humanity may depend on what the superintelligence does.
Science fact is catching up to science fiction.
The first truly intelligent machine will be the last invention that humanity needs to make.
The only scarcity that will exist in the future is that which we decide to create ourselves as humans.
Within a 10-year design revolution, we can have all humanity living the highest standard of living anybody's ever known.
Progress is accelerating at an exponential pace, and it's going to reach a point where progress is so fast it's going to be a singularity.
We are probably one of the last generations of Homo sapiens.
Every single headline points to the birth pangs of a Type 1 civilization.